The mind is supposed to be reliable, a memory, a face, a voice you recognize as your own. It is a system built around certainty, the belief that what you see belongs to the room you're standing in, that what you hear has a source, and that the people you love remain who they've always been. Most people trust that system because it's internal, because it's automatic, because perception feels immediate and unquestionable. But the mind is not protection, it is interpretation. And interpretation can shift. A sound can exist without a speaker. A blink can last half a second too long. A familiar face can look exactly the same and still feel wrong. That is the part most people don't want to admit. That horror does not always enter through a door. Sometimes it begins quietly, inside the place you trust most. Because the most disturbing distortions don't start with chaos. They start with something routine. A whisper that sounds like your name. A pause before an answer that used to come instantly. A presence you cannot prove, but cannot ignore. And once certainty begins to erode, the question isn't whether something is happening. The question is whether you can still trust yourself to interpret it. Tonight's stories are not about demons or the supernatural. They are about untreated mental health crises. About the thin line between perception and misperception. About how real something can feel when your brain insists on it. And about how long someone can rationalize what's happening before asking for help. Before we begin, there is something important to say. Mental illness is not horror. Struggling with your mental health is not weakness. If something feels off, if your thoughts feel unfamiliar, if your perception feels unreliable, please reach out to someone. A friend, a family member, a professional. Help exists. Seeking it is strength, not failure. These stories explore what can happen before the diagnosis, before the support, before someone says the words out loud. Tonight, these are two chilling mental health horror stories, and they both begin the same way, with something small that should have been easy to ignore. Story 1. The Voice That Learned My Name. I used to think I'd be good at catching it early. That was my quiet arrogance, the kind you don't announce out loud because you know how it sounds. I was 22, halfway through my second year at community college, and I'd built my whole identity around being the rational one. The guy who could step back, label a thing, file it, and move on. I was studying psychology because I liked patterns. I liked the idea that something that felt random could be understood if you looked at it long enough. Abnormal psych, especially. The chapters everyone else skimmed because they were too heavy, too strange, too sad. In Lancaster, it's easy to feel like you're tucked away from the rest of the world. Downtown has its small, clean streets, the cafes, the old brick buildings trying to look charming instead of aged. My apartment was above a closed tailor shop on a side street a few blocks from the center. Second floor, narrow staircase, one bedroom, thin walls, windows that rattled when a truck rolled by. I lived alone because I told myself it would keep me focused. No roommates to distract me, no noise, no drama. I worked part-time in a campus computer lab, paid my rent, bought groceries, and came home to read and highlight and rewrite notes until they looked like something I could control. The first time I heard it, I didn't even turn around. It was late, the kind of late where your brain feels sticky, like every thought has to drag itself across the surface. My desk faced the wall, my laptop open, textbook spread flat like it had weight. The refrigerator in the kitchenette hummed, steady and familiar. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering on wet pavement. Then someone said my name. Malachi, soft, close, almost behind my ear. Not loud, not threatening, not even urgent, just present. I froze with my fingers hovering over the keys. My first thought was the neighbor. The building had a couple units. You could hear people cough, argue, laugh. Maybe someone had come up the stairs and was outside my door. Maybe I'd left music playing too loud. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No knock. No murmur through the walls. I slowly swiveled my chair, expecting to see a silhouette in the doorway, a reflection in the dark window. There was only my apartment, dim and ordinary. The living room lamp threw a warm circle on the carpet. The kitchen counter was cluttered with a drying rack and a mug I hadn't washed. I got up and checked the peephole. Empty hallway, cheap brown carpet, a faint smell of someone's laundry detergent. I went back to my desk and tried to laugh it off. Stress, sleep deprivation, auditory misperception. The hum of the refrigerator had a rhythm. Sometimes the brain makes words out of rhythm. I wrote it down anyway, because that's what I did when something didn't fit. I kept a notebook for class. Dates, symptoms, theories, differential diagnoses. I flipped to a clean page and wrote, Entry 1, 11:47 p.m. Possible hypnagogic hallucination. Heard name spoken softly behind me. No source identified. It looked clinical on paper. Safe. 2 nights later, it happened again. I was awake. Fully awake. I'd had a coffee earlier. I had been pacing, stretching, trying to keep myself alert because I had a quiz coming up on psychosis and mood disorders and I wanted to score high enough to feel like I belonged in the conversation. I sat down, opened my laptop, and before the screen even finished waking, I heard it. Malachi. Same softness, same closeness. This time, I turned immediately. Nothing. My heart had a brief, stupid stutter. I hated that my body reacted before my brain could organize the facts. I wrote again. Entry 2, 12:18 a.m. Occurred while fully awake. No fatigue present, no substances, no clear trigger. Then the voice changed. It stopped being just my name. It started speaking in full phrases, like it had been listening long enough to learn the shape of my life. You're up late again. The first time it said that, I was holding my phone, scrolling through lecture slides. The words didn't come from any direction. They were simply there, in the air, as if someone had leaned close to share a secret. I held my breath and waited for the follow-up. Some explanation, some laugh, a neighbor's TV, anything. Silence. The next night, as I read a section on auditory hallucinations, the voice returned. That's not what the book says. I slammed the textbook shut so hard, the dust jacket slid off. My lamp flickered and steadied. I stared at the closed cover, then at my hands, then at the room as if it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. I told myself it was stress. Anxiety can do strange things. Sleep deprivation can do stranger. Lancaster winter was gray and my schedule was bad. I wasn't eating great. I was alone. Alone can echo. Still, I started documenting like my grade depended on it. Timestamps. Conditions. What I was doing. How much sleep I'd gotten. Whether I'd eaten. The voice stayed loyal to its rules. It never spoke during the day. It never spoke when someone else was in the room. It only appeared at night, always when I was alone, always when the apartment had settled into that quiet hum that feels thick enough to touch. A week passed. Then the voice began predicting things. Small things, at first. The kind of coincidence you can dismiss if you're stubborn. You're going to get a message. My phone vibrated 5 seconds later. You're going to hear the door. A distant knock echoed through the building. Not mine, someone else's, muffled by walls. You forgot to lock it. That one got me. Because I walked to the door and checked, and my hand went cold on the knob. Unlocked. I stood there for a long time, staring at the deadbolt like it had betrayed me. I locked it, then checked the windows, then checked again. My brain tried to patch the gap with an explanation. I must have forgotten. I must have been distracted. It happens. But the voice had known. I began to fear my own routine. The little automatic motions I had always trusted became suspicious. I started double-checking everything. The stove, the lock, the lights, my alarm, my email. I reread messages I'd sent to make sure they sounded like me. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. It wasn't because I didn't have people. I had classmates, a professor I liked, a few friends from the lab. I even had a sister in York who texted me too often and would have driven over immediately if I said something sounded wrong. I didn't tell anyone because I thought I could solve it, because I thought that if I could name it, it couldn't own me. Then the visual distortions began. It started with movement in the corners of my eyes, a flicker by the bedroom door, a shift behind the couch, the kind of motion you see when you stare too long at a screen and then look up, the world briefly uncertain. I blamed my eyes. I blamed the lighting. I blamed my exhausted brain, but it kept happening. I would be washing dishes and see, in the dark reflection of the microwave door, a shape behind me. I would spin, dripping soap onto the floor, and find only empty air and the hum of the refrigerator. I began leaving lights on, not because it fixed anything, but because darkness made the distortions easier to believe. The shadow came later. At first, it was just a darker smear near the bedroom door, a vertical density that didn't match the angle of any lamp or street light. I would glance at it, and it would vanish, as if it only existed in the moment before my eyes focused. When it appeared, the voice was always nearby, closer, clearer. Once, sitting at my desk, with my notebook open, I heard, "Look at it." My eyes lifted to the hallway. The shape was there, a tall, narrow column of darkness, like a person standing perfectly still with the lights off around them. I stared until my eyes watered. "Don't blink," the voice said. Not cruel, not mocking, just calm. I blinked. It was gone. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I wrote in the notebook with a hand that felt slightly detached, like it belonged to a different version of me. Peripheral visual disturbance. Shadow-like vertical form near bedroom door. Appears briefly, disappears upon direct focus, or blink. Auditory hallucination present simultaneously. Even writing those words felt like bargaining. If I used the right terms, if I kept it academic, maybe it wouldn't become real, but it was real to me. That's the part people don't understand until it happens. The mind doesn't label it as hallucination when you're inside it. The mind accepts what it receives. It builds around it. It makes it coherent. Weeks passed. I stopped counting them accurately. I became methodical in a way that was almost frightening in hindsight. I set my phone to record audio overnight. I propped my laptop camera to face the hallway. I bought a cheap motion sensor nightlight and plugged it in near the bedroom door. I wasn't trying to prove it to anyone else. I was trying to prove it to myself. The voice, as if amused by my effort, became more articulate. I'm easier to see now. It said that one night when I was standing in the kitchen drinking water, staring into the dark hallway like it might swallow me if I looked away. I'm learning, it said another night. Learning what? I wanted to ask. Learning me, apparently. It started repeating phrases I'd said earlier in the day. It started quoting my lecture notes. It started speaking with the cadence of my own inner voice, only slightly shifted, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. You missed something, it said often. It didn't tell me what. It just let the sentence hang there until my brain filled the empty space with dread. I stopped going to class. At first I told myself it was temporary, just a rough week. Then I emailed my professors vague excuses. Then I stopped replying at all. My phone felt dangerous. Every vibration made my stomach tighten. A call from my sister went unanswered for days. I slept in pieces. When I did sleep, I woke up with the impression that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed, watching me breathe. I would sit up, heart pounding, and stare into the darkness until my eyes adjusted. Sometimes I saw nothing. Sometimes I saw that vertical shape in the doorway, more defined now, broader at the shoulders, like darkness had decided on a human outline. It didn't move. That was almost worse. Then came the recordings. The audio files were mostly useless. The hum of my refrigerator, the occasional car outside, the building creaking. Once, faint laughter from somewhere below. No voice saying my name. No whispers. The laptop camera caught nothing but grainy hallway footage and me pacing like a trapped animal. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something sharper. Confusion that turned into certainty. Because I remembered it. I remembered the voice as clearly as I remembered my own thoughts. If the recordings didn't catch it, then either my equipment was failing or something else was. I started playing the audio back through headphones at night, volume up, trying to find it between the hums and pops. I leaned forward until my neck ached, as if proximity could force the truth to show itself. One night, almost 3 a.m, I heard something on the playback. Not the voice I'd been hearing. My own voice. Low, close to the microphone. Don't turn around. My skin went tight. I replayed it 3 times to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The words were there every time, quiet but clear, spoken as if I had leaned over the phone while it recorded and whispered into it. I did not remember doing that. I sat in the blue light of my laptop and stared at my hands. I tried to reconstruct the night. Had I sleepwalked? Had I talked to my sleep? Had I woken up and forgotten? The voice returned, gentle as a breath. You did it, it said. I pressed my palms to my temples. Stop, I whispered. The first time I'd spoken back. The air felt thick. "You're closer now," the voice said. I looked toward the hallway, without meaning to. The shadow stood there. Not a column anymore. Not an absence, but a figure. Still featureless, still dark, but shaped, as if darkness had thickened into a person and decided to remain. "I'm here," the voice said, and for the first time it sounded satisfied. The next day, daylight didn't fix it. That's another lie people tell themselves, that if something is wrong at night, daylight will wash it away. Lancaster in the morning is soft and gray. Sunlight filtered through clouds, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly distant. I made coffee with hands that shook. I opened the blinds. I sat on the couch and tried to ground myself in normal things. The sound of the radiator, a car horn outside, the smell of roasted beans. Then, in the corner of the living room, near the window, I saw it. Not solid, but present. A deeper shadow where no shadow should be. My breath caught. I stared at it until my eyes burned. It didn't disappear. It didn't shift with the light. It didn't care that it was day. It felt like something crossing a threshold. The voice didn't speak. It didn't need to. The fear wasn't the idea of a monster in my apartment. The fear was the realization that my own senses had become unreliable, and that I could no longer tell where the world ended and my perception began. That day, I finally told someone. Not my sister. Not a friend. I did what I always did when I was terrified. I went to a system. I found a clinic in Lancaster that did psychiatric evaluations. I filled out an online intake form with fingers that felt heavy. I checked boxes. I answered questions about sleep and appetite and stress. I hesitated over the section about hallucinations, then forced myself to select yes. I almost closed the tab. Instead, I hit submit. The appointment was 3 days away. Those 3 days felt like weeks. The voice stayed, but it changed its strategy. It became quieter, as if it didn't want to be documented anymore. It spoke less and lingered more. The shadow appeared in the hallway and stayed there, motionless, letting my eyes adjust to it until it felt almost ordinary, like a coat hanging in the wrong place. That ordinariness frightened me most of all. On the day of the appointment, I walked through downtown Lancaster with a winter wind cutting between buildings. People passed me carrying coffee, laughing, checking their phones, living inside their own problems. I felt like I was walking behind a pane of glass, seeing life but not quite inside it. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and old carpet. The waiting room had magazines no one touched, and a fish tank bubbling quietly in the corner. I sat with my hands clasped hard enough to hurt. When the psychiatrist called my name, I stood too fast and nearly stumbled. She was calm, middle-aged, kind eyes, a small office with a desk, a plant, a box of tissues that looked intentionally placed. "What brings you in?" she asked. The words came out like I'd been holding them in my chest for months. "I've been hearing things," I said. "At night. A voice. And now I've been seeing a shadow. It's getting worse." Her expression didn't change in a way that made me feel judged. It changed in a way that made me feel seen. We talked for a long time. She asked questions I'd read in textbooks, questions that sounded familiar until they were directed at me. About the onset, about stress, about substance use, about family history, about paranoia, about sleep, about whether I felt like someone was watching me. I told her about the notebook, about the recordings, about the phrase on playback that sounded like me. I told her the part I hadn't written down, that sometimes, when the apartment was silent, I felt like the voice was not in the room but in my head, wearing my own thoughts like a mask. When she finally said the words, they landed with a weight I had expected and still wasn't prepared to carry. "Based on what you've described, we may be looking at a schizophrenia spectrum disorder," she said carefully. "We can't confirm anything in one session, but your symptoms fit. The good news is that there are effective treatments. Medication can reduce hallucinations significantly. Therapy can help. You don't have to manage this alone." I nodded, like a student, absorbing information. I asked about side effects. I asked about duration. I asked about prognosis. I did not say, out loud, the thought that had been crawling in the back of my mind for weeks. If it's a hallucination, why does it feel like it knows me? Medication began that week. The first nights were strange. My body felt heavy, my thoughts slower, as if someone had placed a thick blanket over my mind. I slept longer than I had in months, deep and dreamless. The voice didn't vanish all at once. It faded, like a radio losing signal. Some nights, it would whisper my name, and then drift away before it could finish a sentence. Some nights, it was silent, and the silence itself felt loud, like the apartment was waiting to see what I would do without it. The shadow became less defined. It returned to the corners, to peripheral flickers, to brief densities that could be mistaken for light and shadow. I started going back to class part-time. I answered my sister's texts. I ate real meals. I sat in lecture halls and listened to professors talk about symptoms I now understood in a way I never wanted. I kept journaling, but my notes changed. They were less frantic, more grounded. I wrote about sleep and mood and medication. I wrote about the strange grief of losing something that had terrified me, but had also been constant. Weeks became months. There were good days. There were days where the world felt sharp again, trustworthy. There were days where I caught myself laughing at something stupid on my phone, then paused because the sound of my own laughter felt unfamiliar after so long. And there were nights, quieter than the rest, where I would be sitting at my desk writing in my new journal, and the apartment would settle around me in that familiar hum. The refrigerator, the distant traffic, the building shifting. I would pause, with my pen hovering. Not because I heard something, because I remembered hearing it. Because memory, in the dark, can behave like a presence. I learned not to chase it. I learned not to test it, not to stare into corners until my brain began manufacturing shapes. I learned the rituals that kept me steady. Lights low, but not off. Music softly playing, breathing slow, phone face down, journal open. That night, the last night I wrote about it, in the way you might write about a storm after it passes, I sat at my desk and listened to the room. Silence, mostly. No voice, no whisper, no name. Just the ordinary world, finally returning. I turned to a clean page and wrote the date. I wrote my own name at the top, as if I needed to remind myself who I was. Then I stopped. The hallway outside my bedroom door was dark. It always was. That was normal. Darkness in a hallway is just darkness. Still, my eyes drifted there. I didn't see anything, but my body responded anyway, the way a person flinches long after a bruise has healed. I lowered my gaze back to the page and wrote, carefully, in my own handwriting, I know it isn't there anymore. I just don't know if it knows that. Story 2. She blinked differently. If you asked me to describe our life before it started, I would have said predictable, and meant it as a compliment. I'm 34, the kind of person who finds comfort in routines. I work IT for a mid-sized logistics company outside Harrisburg, the kind of place where your biggest emergencies are forgotten passwords and printers that decide to die 5 minutes before a meeting. I like problems with causes. I like solutions you can test. My wife, Elena, would tease me about it. She'd call me Mr. Troubleshooting, smiling as she said it, her voice warm enough to make it affectionate instead of sharp. We'd been together 9 years, married for 4. We lived in a townhouse just far enough from the city that the nights were quiet, and the streetlights cast long, steady pools of sodium glow on the pavement. We were not dramatic people. We did not fight with slammed doors. We did not throw dishes. We paid our bills, ate dinner on the couch, went to family gatherings, complained about traffic, talked about whether we should get a dog. That's why it took me so long to understand what was happening. Because it didn't start with something big. It started with a blink. Elena was standing at the kitchen counter one night, rinsing strawberries in a colander. Her hair was pulled back, sleeves rolled, the tiny scar on her knuckle visible as she worked. She looked up at me, asked if I wanted any, and blinked. Just once. But the blink was wrong. That's the only word that fits. And it's a bad one, because it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't rapid. It wasn't exaggerated. It was slower than normal, as if she was thinking about blinking first. A deliberate motion, like she was remembering how. I stared at her longer than I meant to. She raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked, still holding the colander. "Nothing," I said. "Just tired." She smiled and went back to rinsing the fruit. Water hissed. The refrigerator hummed. The house felt exactly like our house. I told myself my brain was reaching for meaning where there was none. That's what brains do. They find patterns, even in static. A few days passed, then a week. I forgot about it. Or I thought I did. Then it happened again. We were watching TV. Some forgettable true crime series. The kind with soft music and ominous voiceovers. Elena leaned back into the corner of the couch, her feet tucked under her, and laughed at something I said. She looked at me, and she blinked. It was slow. It was measured. It was too controlled. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear exactly. More like recognition without context. Like seeing a familiar object in the wrong place. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on the show, but my eyes kept drifting back to her face. Watching. Waiting. She blinked normally a few minutes later, then normally again. I felt my tension ease, and hated myself for it. Who monitors someone's blinking? A person who's tired. A person who's stressed. A person who works too much and reads too many articles about neurological disorders because he spends his day solving problems, and his brain thinks every problem should be solvable. Then the other differences appeared. They were micro differences, the kind you can't point to and prove, the kind that make you feel like you're losing your mind because you can't defend them with evidence. Elena started pausing before she answered questions, just half a second longer than normal. Not hesitation, not confusion. More like she was selecting the correct response from a list. She stood in doorways, sometimes without speaking. I'd glance up from my laptop and find her in the hallway, still and quiet, watching me. When I asked what she wanted, she'd blink, then say she was just thinking about something. She began humming songs she claimed she didn't know. I caught her one morning, making coffee, humming a melody that sounded vaguely familiar. When I asked her what it was, she shrugged. No idea, she said. Just stuck in my head. But she hummed it again 2 days later. Same tune, same rhythm, as if it belonged to a program running in the background of her mind. At first, I assumed stress. She'd been busy at work. We'd had a few family obligations. Winter had been long and gray. People get weird in winter. But the feeling didn't leave. That feeling that something small had shifted, and my brain was refusing to let it go. So I did what I always do when something makes me uncomfortable. I documented it. I made a spreadsheet. It started as a joke, honestly. Something to make me feel less ridiculous. I opened Excel and created columns. Date, time, observation, context, notes. I titled the file something harmless, sleep study, as if I was tracking my own habits. The first entry was simple. January 8th, 9:14 p.m. Blink slower than usual, during conversation. Then, January 11th, 6:32 a.m. Pause before answering question about weekend plans. Then, January 13th, 10:27 p.m. Standing in doorway. Silent. Asked what's wrong. Said nothing. I added notes like a clinician. I tried to keep it neutral. I told myself it was anxiety, that I was being paranoid, that I would collect a week of data and then laugh at myself. Instead, the data made it worse, because I started seeing patterns. The slower blinks happened most often at night. The doorway standing happened after she'd been quiet for a while. The humming happened when she thought no one was listening. I began researching neurological disorders, because that was the most acceptable explanation. Brain tumors, early onset dementia, parasomnias, seizure disorders. I read about subtle personality changes, about how the brain can quietly rewrite a person while their body looks the same. I did not, at first, consider the disorder might be mine. I didn't want to, because if Elena was sick, that was tragic but solvable. There were doctors, there were scans, there were treatments. If Elena was changed, that meant there was a cause in the world. If I was the one misperceiving, the cause was inside my head. And inside my head is the one place I'd always assumed was safe. So instead of confronting the possibility, I tried to gather proof. I bought small home cameras online, the cheap kind that connect to your phone. I told Elena they were for security. There'd been some package thefts in the neighborhood, which was true. She didn't argue. She barely looked up from her phone. Sure, she said. Whatever makes you feel better. The phrase lodged in me. Whatever makes you feel better. Because it wasn't what she usually said. Elena teased. Elena asked questions. Elena rolled her eyes when I over-engineered something. Whatever makes you feel better felt like something said to a stranger. I installed one camera in the living room, angled toward the hallway. One in the kitchen, covering the back door. One facing the front entrance. The first night, I sat in bed with my phone, watching live footage like a lunatic. Elena slept beside me, breathing slow and even. I told myself I was being responsible, that security was normal, that everyone has cameras now. At 2:13 a.m., I checked the hallway feed. Nothing. Just darkness and faint light from the street outside. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by frustration. Part of me wanted to catch something, any proof that would justify the way my brain kept flinching. The next days, I reviewed footage obsessively. On video, Elena looked completely normal, warm, consistent, unchanged. She laughed at a joke. She wandered into the kitchen in socks. She kissed me on the cheek when she got home. She scratched her head, blinked normally, moved like herself. Every time I watched the footage, my stomach twisted, because it didn't match what I felt in person. In person, her gaze lingered too long. In person, her smile seemed slightly delayed, like it was arriving after she had decided to use it. In person, her voice felt fractionally different, just a shift in cadence I couldn't explain. If you've never experienced that kind of dissonance, it's hard to describe. It's like seeing a familiar photo that's been edited so slightly you can't prove it, but you can't stop staring because something is wrong. Then came the night she stood beside the bed. I woke up because I felt watched. That sounds dramatic, but it's the simplest truth. My eyes opened to darkness, and I saw her silhouette standing over me. Elena, still. Hands at her sides. Head tilted down toward me. The digital clock glowed 3:04 a.m. I sat up so fast, my neck hurt. Elena, I whispered, throat dry. What are you doing? She didn't answer immediately. She blinked, slow, deliberate. Then she said, You were talking. My heart hammered. Talking? She nodded once. In your sleep. I stared at her face, trying to see my wife in it, trying to match this moment to a version of her I recognized. Did I say something? I asked. She blinked again, slower. I couldn't understand it. I forced a laugh that sounded thin, even to me. Great. Now I'm sleep-talking. She didn't smile. She just stood there, another beat, then turned and walked back to bed as if she'd completed a task. As she lay down, she faced away from me. I stayed sitting upright, long after she started breathing evenly again. The next morning, she acted normal. She made coffee, asked me about my day, kissed me goodbye. I watched her blink, and it was normal. That made it worse, because it meant either I'd dreamed it, or she was capable of switching back and forth, like a mask. That was the night I stopped touching her. Not dramatically, not with an argument. I simply began creating distance. I made excuses about being tired, about having a headache, about wanting to fall asleep early. I stayed up later than her, pretending to work, then slipped into bed carefully and faced away from her. I started testing her. Small tests at first. Questions about shared memories. What was the name of that Thai place we went to on our second anniversary? She answered correctly. What did you wear to my cousin's wedding? Correct. What movie did we see the first time you came to my apartment? Correct. Every answer was right. That should have ended it. It should have proven I was wrong. Instead, it made the sensation sharper. Because if she was an imposter, she was a perfect one. Not dramatically, not violently, precisely. The thought arrived so quietly, I didn't even realize I'd accepted it until it was already part of my reality. Elena has been replaced. I tried to argue with myself. I tried to label it as paranoia. I tried to say the word impossible and make it stick. But the more I resisted, the more my brain supplied evidence. Her blink, her pause, her doorway standing, her humming, the phrase, whatever makes you feel better, the way she looked at me sometimes, like she was studying. The spreadsheet grew frantic. I added new columns, frequency, duration, intensity rating. I started writing notes like, Eye contact sustained 2 to 3 seconds longer than baseline. Smiled 1.2 seconds after joke. Stood in hallway at 7:52 p.m. for 18 seconds without speaking. I hated myself for measuring my wife like a specimen. I hated the part of my brain that believed it mattered. I began sleeping in the locked guest room. The first night I did it, Elena didn't argue. She stood in the doorway, watching me carry my pillow down the hall. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice sounded right. That was the cruelest part. Everything sounded right. "I'm just not sleeping well," I said. "I don't want to keep you up." She blinked, slow. "Okay," she said. "Good night." I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. There were no footsteps, no whispering, no movement. Just the house settling and my own breathing too loud in my ears. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I wasn't afraid, but I slept with my phone in my hand, screen facing up, as if light could protect me. At work, I started making mistakes. My mind wandered. I reread the same email 3 times and couldn't absorb it. A coworker asked if I was okay and I snapped at him, then apologized too quickly. I started thinking about other explanations again, because the imposter belief was too insane to hold for long stretches without my rational mind fighting back. Maybe I was sick. Maybe I had a tumor. Maybe I was having seizures. Maybe I was losing it. I made an appointment with a neurologist under the pretense of stress headaches. That part was true. My head felt constantly tight, as if my skull was shrinking. The neurologist did basic tests, asked questions, recommended imaging. My MRI came back normal. My blood work was normal. Normal. I should have felt relieved. Instead, the normal results removed my last external anchor. If my brain was physically fine, then what was wrong with me? A week later, a psychiatrist entered the picture because the neurologist recommended it gently, like suggesting therapy for stress. I resisted at first. I didn't want the label. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to admit that my mind, the tool I trusted most, was misfiring. But I was tired. I was losing sleep. I was losing myself. So I went. The psychiatrist's office was in Harrisburg, in a building that smelled faintly like old paper and hand sanitizer. The waiting room was quiet, like a library. I sat with my hands clasped, feeling ridiculous. When the psychiatrist asked me what was wrong, I didn't say, "My wife has been replaced." Not at first. I said, "Something feels off." He nodded. "Tell me more." So I told him about the blink, about the pauses, about the doorway standing, about the spreadsheet I'd created, my voice trying to keep it clinical even as my throat tightened. I told him about the cameras, and how on video she looked normal. I told him about waking up to her, standing over the bed. I told him about how I'd stopped touching her, how I'd moved into the guest room, how I couldn't explain why I was afraid, but I was. He listened without reacting, the way professionals do. Expression steady, eyes attentive. Then he asked, very gently, "Do you believe your wife is the same person she has always been?" The question hit me like cold water. I tried to answer quickly, to dismiss it. "Yes," I said, too fast. He waited. The silence stretched. My mouth went dry. I swallowed and said, quieter, "She looks like her." He nodded as if that distinction mattered, and his calmness made my stomach drop. "There is a condition," he said, "where a person recognizes someone visually, but the emotional recognition doesn't connect properly. The brain tries to explain that mismatch." I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "It's called Capgras delusion," he said. "It can occur in several contexts. Delusional disorders, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, mood disorders with psychosis, neurological conditions. In Capgras, a person believes a loved one has been replaced by an identical imposter." My first reaction was anger. "No," I said. "That's not what this is." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He asked questions instead. About my stress levels. About my sleep. About whether I'd felt detached from reality. About whether I'd had any other odd beliefs. About my family history. I answered, my voice rising, trying to prove I was sane by being detailed. Then he asked a question that made me pause. "When did you last review your camera footage?" "Last night," I said. And what did you see? Nothing, I said. Just normal. He nodded. So the evidence suggests she is unchanged. My throat tightened. Evidence isn't everything. That's what I said. Evidence isn't everything. It sounded like something my wife would mock me for, gently, affectionately. It sounded like the opposite of who I was. The psychiatrist prescribed medication. He recommended therapy. He suggested, kindly, that I consider voluntary admission for stabilization because my sleep was dangerously poor and my anxiety was severe. I refused. At first. Then, the night that broke me happened. I was in the guest room, laptop open, watching the living room camera feed. Elena was asleep in our bedroom. The house was silent. The time in the corner of the footage read 2:13 a.m. I felt my chest tighten, the number familiar in a way that made no sense. My eyes stayed locked on the screen. The living room was empty, the hallway dark. The faint glow from the streetlight outside painted pale stripes on the floor. Then something moved. A figure stepped into the hallway. At first, I thought it was Elena, maybe getting water. Then I recognized my own posture, my own shoulders, my own way of standing with weight slightly on my right leg. It was me, captured on camera, standing in the dark hallway outside the bedroom. I leaned closer, breath shallow. On the footage, I lifted my head slightly, as if listening. Then I whispered something. The audio was faint, but the camera microphone caught it. She knows. My skin went cold. I rewound it, played it again, and again. Same words, same whisper, same calm. I did not remember getting out of bed. I did not remember walking down the hallway. I did not remember speaking. I watched it until my vision blurred. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight thinned through the window, and looked at Elena as she stirred coffee. Her face was her face. Her hands were her hands. She blinked, perfectly normal. I felt a wave of nausea so sudden I had to grip the table. Elena looked up. Dan, are you okay? The way she said my name sounded like my wife. That broke something in me. Not relief, but grief. Because if she was my wife, then the monster was in my own head. I told her I needed help. I didn't explain beyond that. I couldn't. I didn't want the words to contaminate her, to turn my delusion into something she'd carry with her. I drove myself to the hospital in Harrisburg and admitted myself voluntarily. The first days were fog. Medication made my thoughts heavy. Sleep came in long blocks, like my body was catching up for lost time. Nurses asked questions. Therapists spoke softly. Days were structured. Meals at set times. Groups. Assessments. I hated the lack of control and needed it at the same time. The certainty began to weaken, not like a light switching off, but like a grip loosening. In the hospital, away from Elena, the belief didn't have fresh fuel. It couldn't feed on micro differences and late night watching. It had to survive on memory, and memory is less convincing in fluorescent light. When Elena visited, I watched her like a guilty man. She sat across from me in the visitor room, her hands folded, her eyes tired from crying. She looked exactly like herself, and yet my brain still reached for the old explanation out of habit. Imposter. Replacement. Danger. The medication blunted the edge of those thoughts. It made them feel less like truth and more like a suggestion, a possibility my brain was offering, not a fact. Elena spoke quietly, asking what she could do, telling me she loved me, that she was scared, but she was here. I listened, and tears came unexpectedly. Not dramatic sobs, just a steady release I couldn't stop. When I was discharged, the psychiatrist warned me that the belief could return under stress, that recovery wasn't linear, that my brain had learned a pattern and might try to fall back into it when exhausted. I nodded. I took the discharge papers. I promised I'd continue treatment. At home, Elena hugged me in the hallway. Her arms were warm. Her perfume was familiar. My body leaned into her before my mind could question it. For a moment, I felt normal. Then she pulled away, and she blinked. Perfectly normally. It should have been nothing. A blink is nothing, but my attention snapped to it like a magnet finding metal. I felt the old fear stir, small and automatic. My chest tightened. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was better. Elena smiled, and the smile looked like hers. The house smelled like coffee, and clean laundry. The street outside was quiet. Everything was ordinary. Still, later that night, when Elena was talking about her day, I watched her eyes, not openly, not dramatically. I watched in the way you watch a stove burner after it's been turned off, checking for heat you can't see. And when she held eye contact, I counted the seconds in my head, just in case. You've reached the end of tonight's stories. The final moment where the room goes quiet, the lights dim, and the world settles back into something that feels stable again. Familiar, recognizable. But if anything lingered tonight, if any part of these stories stayed with you longer than it should have, it's because the horror wasn't a monster in the dark. It was uncertainty. A voice that felt real because it was experienced as real. A loved one who looked the same, yet felt unfamiliar. A mind trying to make sense of something it didn't understand. Because the most frightening part of losing your grip on reality isn't what you see. It's how convincing it feels. Malachi didn't fear the shadow because it was dramatic. He feared it because it aligned with his thoughts, because it learned his patterns, because it felt personal. Daniel didn't fear his wife because she changed. He feared her because she didn't. Because his certainty fractured, and his brain built an explanation to protect itself. These stories were not about madness. They were about delay, about isolation, about what happens when someone tries to solve something alone for too long. And if there is one thing more important than the horror tonight, it's this. If something feels off in your mind, if your thoughts don't feel like your own, if your perception feels unreliable, do not sit with it in silence. Talk to someone. Reach out. Seek help. There is strength in asking for support. There is courage in admitting something isn't right, and there are people trained to help you through it. The mind is powerful, but it is not meant to carry everything alone. If these stories unsettled you, that means they did their job. But they should not leave you hopeless. They should leave you aware of how fragile certainty can be, aware of how important early help is, aware that struggling does not make you broken. If you want more stories like this, stories that explore the quiet fractures beneath everyday life, subscribe. Let me know in the comments which story stayed with you the longest, the voice that learned a name, or the blink that lasted half a second too long. Like the video so these stories reach others who still believe horror always announces itself loudly, when sometimes it arrives quietly, in routines, in relationships, in the spaces we assume are safest. And if you have a story of your own, an experience that changed the way you trusted your mind, you can always share it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying through the silence. Protect your peace. Pay attention to your thoughts. And remember, the most dangerous distortions don't begin with chaos. They begin with something small. And until next time, the dark awaits.